Part 1. Hook. At 2:11 a.m., in the middle of a thunderstorm that had turned the streets of Harlow City into rivers of black water, a woman walked out of Mercy Crest Medical Center carrying a cardboard box in her dignity because they had only managed to take one of those things from her. Her name was Dara Miles, 32 years old, night shift ER nurse, the kind of person who memorized every patient's name, who stayed 20 minutes past her shift to hold a frightened man's hand before surgery, who had never once been late in 4 years. They fired her in front of the entire nursing staff. 19 minutes later, black military helicopters cut through the rain and circled the hospital roof. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will leave you stunned. Hit that like button, follow along so you don't miss a single part, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story can travel. The night had started like every other night at Mercy Crest. Controlled chaos wrapped in fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic and old coffee. Dara Miles had clocked in at 6:47 p.m., 13 minutes before her shift began, the same way she always did. She kept her locker organized with the kind of precision that had nothing to do with hospital policy and everything to do with habit. Trauma shears on the left, pen light in the inner pocket, backup gloves folded flat. She had learned long ago that when things went sideways, you didn't want to be searching for your equipment. You wanted your hands to already know where everything was. The ER that night was mid-volume. 2 drunk driving injuries from the 5 freeway, a construction worker with a compound fracture of the radius that made even the attending wince, an elderly woman with chest pain who turned out to have anxiety but needed 4 hours of monitoring before anyone was confident enough to say so. Dara moved through it all without urgency and without hesitation, not because she was careless, but because she had been trained in environments where hesitation cost lives. Nobody at Mercy Crest knew that. Nobody had asked. She had come to them 4 years ago with a nursing license, a clean record, and a resume that listed 2 years of ER experience in a civilian hospital in Nevada. The gap before that, 6 years, was marked simply as prior service. Nobody followed up. Civilian hospitals rarely did. They needed bodies, and she had credentials, and that was usually enough. What the resume did not say, that she had spent those 6 years as a special operations combat medical specialist, attached to units whose names she was not allowed to speak in public. That she had worked trauma cases in conditions no emergency room in this country would ever replicate. That she had been awarded commendations she kept in a locked box under her bed and never discussed with anyone. She had left that life deliberately. She had chosen quiet. She had chosen ordinary. Ordinary had worked fine until Dr. Marcus Vale arrived at Mercy Crest 14 months ago as Chief of Emergency Medicine. Now, Vale was 47, silver-haired in the way that photographed well, and operated with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything, or had simply never been in a room where the consequences of being wrong were immediate and irreversible. He had trained at a respected program, published several papers in journals that other physicians cited without reading, and had a talent for making nurses feel precisely as useful as the equipment carts they pushed. He did not like Dara Miles. He had made that clear within his first week, though he had never said it directly. It came through in the way he spoke over her in team briefings, in the way he would redirect her patient observations through the residents as though she had not spoken, in the way he would look at her suggestions with a faint, patient expression, the expression of a person indulging someone they considered below them. She had documented every instance, not out of paranoia, out of discipline. The first real collision had come 3 months into his tenure. A 44-year-old male, brought in by ambulance following a workplace accident, industrial press injury, left forearm. The paramedics had stabilized the obvious wound, but Dara had noticed something in the patient's presentation that didn't fit the mechanism of injury. The blood pressure was off. Not dramatically, not the kind of numbers that triggered automated alerts, but the pattern was wrong. The subtle pallor around the mouth, the way he was breathing in short, careful increments, the slight rigidity in his abdomen when she palpated during intake. She pulled Vale aside before he entered the bay. "I think there's secondary internal involvement. The abdominal presentation doesn't match a pure extremity injury." Vale had glanced at the chart, then at her. His pressure is within acceptable range. It's trending down over 3 readings, slow enough that the system hasn't flagged it. You're a nurse, he said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. Let the imaging tell us what we need to know. Don't theorize ahead of data. She had stepped back. She had let him proceed. The CT ordered 20 minutes later confirmed a ruptured spleen, secondary trauma from the initial impact, masked by the adrenaline response. The patient went to emergency surgery. He survived, but it was close, and the delay had not helped. Vale never mentioned it afterward. Neither did she, but she had written it down. Date, time, her exact words, his exact words, and the outcome. She kept the document on a password-protected drive she backed up twice a week, because she had also been trained to understand that documentation was the only thing that survived after everything else collapsed. The night of the firing had begun with a trauma activation. 23-year-old male, motorcycle versus SUV, brought in at 9:52 p.m. with significant road rash, a suspected closed head injury, and vitals that were fluctuating in a way that made the whole intake team move faster. His name was Trevor Oakes, and he was conscious enough to be frightened, which Dara considered a reasonable response to his situation. She was running his secondary assessment when she felt it. The change in his muscle tone, the subtle shift in his left pupil response that didn't fully register on a quick glance but was unmistakable if you knew what you were looking for. His blood pressure spiked by 18 points in the span of 4 minutes, then began to drop. His verbal responses were slowing. She stepped out of the bay and found Dr. Vale reviewing imaging at the workstation 20 feet down the hall. Trevor Oakes, Bay 4. I need you to look at him now. I think we're seeing early signs of herniation. Vale did not look up from the screen. He's already in the queue for neurology consult. They'll be down in 40 minutes. He doesn't have 40 minutes. His pupillary response is asymmetric and his pressure pattern is that your clinical diagnosis? He said it with the particular tone he reserved for moments when he wanted an audience to understand the hierarchy. 2 residents were at the adjacent workstation. A charge nurse was 3 feet away. He had chosen the location deliberately, or at least it felt that way. Because last I checked, diagnosis isn't within your scope. I'm telling you what I'm observing. You can act on it, or not. I'll act on the neurology consult when it arrives. He turned back to the screen. Go back to your patient. She went back to the patient. Trevor Oakes lost consciousness at 10:24 p.m. By the time the neurology resident arrived at 10:31 and initiated the emergency response, 7 minutes had passed. The attending neurosurgeon was reached at 10:38. Trevor was in the OR by 10:55. He survived. The surgical team was excellent, but the attending neurosurgeon, a careful woman named Dr. Priya Sohal, who had been at Mercy Crest for 11 years, had written in her post-operative notes that earlier intervention would have reduced operative risk significantly. Dara had read those notes. She had a way of reading things people assumed she didn't have access to. She added them to her documentation. What happened next moved faster than she had anticipated, which told her that Vale had also been keeping documentation, or at least had been preparing. At 1:30 a.m., 2 nights after the Trevor Oakes incident, Dara was called into the administrative conference room on the 3rd floor. She had expected it. Not the specific timing, but the shape of it. Seated at the table were Dr. Marcus Vale, the hospital's HR director, Sylvia Rank, a compact woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head who had the practiced stillness of someone who had conducted many unpleasant conversations, and the ER department's administrative supervisor, a man named Gerald Foss, who had been at Mercy Crest for 22 years and who Dara suspected was present mainly to provide institutional weight. She sat down. We've received multiple reports of conduct concerns, Sylvia began, opening a folder. Specifically, insubordination during active patient care situations, and behavior characterized by other staff as disruptive and undermining of physician authority. Dara looked at the folder. Can I see the specific reports? They're summarized here. I'd like to see the originals. A pause. Sylvia glanced at Vale. That process would go through formal grievance proceedings. Tonight we're here to discuss. Then we should schedule formal grievance proceedings, Dara said, because I'm not going to respond to summaries of complaints I haven't read. Vale leaned forward slightly. Dara, This doesn't have to be adversarial. There's a pattern here that multiple people have. 2 nights ago, I reported an observation about a patient who subsequently required emergency neurosurgery. That observation was dismissed. I'd like that to be part of whatever conversation we're having. The room was quiet for a moment. Gerald Foss cleared his throat. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. The decision's been made, Vale said. We're terminating your employment effective tonight. You'll receive standard severance per your contract, and you're welcome to pursue the grievance process through HR after the fact. She looked at him, directly, steadily, without the flinch he was probably expecting. You're making a mistake, she said. Not about firing me. You can do that. I mean, about the reason and about what you're not documenting on your end. We're quite confident in our documentation. I'm sure you are. She stood. I'll clear my locker, Chad. She was escorted by a security officer named Paul, young, apologetic, clearly unhappy about the assignment, through the ER floor and to the staff corridor. She could feel the attention of the night shift on her as she passed. Some people looked away. One of the younger nurses, a woman named Becca, who Dara had mentored through her first month, held eye contact for a moment and looked devastated. Dara gave her a small nod. It was the best she could offer. She packed her locker in less than 4 minutes. She knew exactly what was hers and what wasn't. She didn't take anything that could be disputed. She left her hospital ID badge on the shelf inside the locker where they would find it, because she was not going to hand it to the security officer and give Vale the satisfaction of a formal surrender. Small things. They still mattered. Paul walked her to the staff exit on the east side of the building. The rain had been building for 2 hours and was now arriving in full force. Sheets of it coming sideways off the parking structure, the kind of rain that made the city look like it was being punished for something. I'm sorry about this, Paul said at the door. He meant it. Don't be, she said. Do your job. Go back inside. She stepped into the rain. The parking lot was half empty at this hour, the remaining cars sitting in pools of reflected light. She had a 12-year-old pickup truck parked in the far corner of the employee lot, gray, unremarkable, a vehicle specifically chosen to be forgettable. She walked toward it with the cardboard box tucked under one arm, not running, not hurrying, letting the rain hit her because there was no point in avoiding it now. She had known this was coming. Not the exact night, but the shape of it. The manufactured complaints, the stacked testimony, the HR language designed to make resistance seem futile. She had seen institutional machinery deployed against inconvenient people before, in contexts far more dangerous than a hospital administration meeting. This was, by comparison, manageable. What she was less certain about was what came next. She put the box in the truck bed under the tarp, got in the cab, and sat for a moment with the rain drumming on the roof. She pulled out her phone, opened the encrypted folder, and confirmed that everything she had compiled over 14 months was still there. Backed up. Intact. Time-stamped and organized in the way she had been trained to organize evidence, with the understanding that it might one day need to be read by people who were not inclined to take her word for anything. She started the engine. She had driven exactly 4 blocks from the hospital when she heard it. What? The sound came from the northeast, low and rhythmic, growing louder faster than she expected. She had learned to recognize it years before she ever wanted to. The heavy, irregular beat of military rotary aircraft, the kind that didn't belong over a civilian city at 2 a.m. 2 separate signatures, she thought, listening without consciously deciding to. Maybe 3. She pulled to the curb. Through the rain-streaked windshield, she watched the lights cross the skyline above the hospital. Not the blinking navigation lights of commercial or news helicopters, but the specific configuration of blacked-out military craft moving with tactical purpose. Moving fast. Moving in a pattern that told her they were not searching. They already knew where they were going. They were going to Mercy Crest. She sat with that for 10 seconds. Then she put the truck in gear and drove back. The east entrance was already showing signs of disruption when she arrived. She could see it from a block away. A security vehicle parked sideways across the ambulance bay entrance, lights running, the driver's door open, and the driver not visible. 2 hospital security officers standing just inside the automatic doors, not moving, looking at something she couldn't see from her angle. She parked on the street, not in the lot. Old habit. She walked toward the building. She didn't announce herself. She had returned her badge, which meant the automatic doors would not read her out. But she knew the east entrance had a sensor malfunction on the secondary panel that had been reported to facilities twice and remained unfixed. She had noticed it 6 weeks ago. She had not reported it a third time. The door opened. Inside, the ER was in a state she recognized. Not quite panic, but the threshold moment before it. Staff clustered in its corridor, some moving with purpose, others stalled in place. 2 uniformed Harlow City police officers were at the main nursing station, talking over each other. Someone had activated the overhead page system and then apparently thought better of it, leaving the speaker clicking with an interrupted announcement. She moved through it without drawing attention. She was wearing her civilian rain jacket over her scrubs, the hospital badge gone. Just a woman in scrubs who might belong here or might not, and nobody was currently focused on sorting that question out. She heard it before she saw it. Voices from Trauma Bay 2, urgent and elevated, one of them a register she did not recognize. Male, controlled, but barely. The kind of voice that was accustomed to giving orders in environments where orders were followed immediately. She reached the bay. Through the window she could see the patient, a man, older, heavyset, in clothes that were wrong for civilian emergency transport. The cut of the jacket, the material, the boots, which were visible below the gurney rail. She had seen that category of clothing before, and not in any emergency room. Dr. Vale was in the bay with 2 residents and a trauma nurse. Vale's body language was completely different from his usual posture. The settled, proprietary confidence had dissolved into something tighter and less certain. He was talking to a man in dark clothes who was standing near the head of the gurney, and the conversation did not look like the kind where Vale was winning. The patient's vitals were visible on the monitor above the bay door. She read them in one pass. She pushed through the door. Vale turned. You don't have clearance to be in here. You're no longer... His pressure is dropping, and you don't have a large-bore IV running. She moved toward the supply cart. Who's managing the line? We are managing this. You need to leave immediately. Is there a second IV access established? One of the residents, a young man named Ferris, who she had worked alongside for 8 months and who was visibly frightened, said, "Antecubital right side, we couldn't get left. Central line? Not yet, Get the kit." She had already located the central line supplies. She turned to the man in dark clothing. "Is there a trauma team inbound with him?" The man stared at her. Something shifted in his expression, something she could not immediately interpret. "Who are you?" he said. "I'm the person who knows what's wrong with your patient right now. Answer the question." Medevac was diverted. "We came direct." "Time of injury?" 51 minutes ago, blast adjacent, blunt force primary. She processed that and turned to Vale. "He needs a central line and he needed it 6 minutes ago. You can file whatever report you want afterward." Vale's face was a study in contradictions. Outrage competing with fear, competing with the basic professional instinct that even arrogant physicians occasionally cannot override when a patient is genuinely in danger. He stepped back. A single, furious, humiliated step back. She moved to the patient's right side. The man on the gurney was watching her. His face was gray and sheened with sweat, and the particular blank focus of someone working very hard to stay conscious. He was looking at her the way people sometimes looked when they were trying to place a face from another context entirely. She prepped the sight. Her hands were steady. They had been trained to stay steady. "This is going to be uncomfortable," she told him. "I've had worse," he said. His voice was rough, labored, but present. "I know," she said, without knowing why she said it. "Hold still." She had the line placed in under 2 minutes. Clean. First pass. No hesitation. The resident Ferris connected the fluids without being asked. The monitor numbers began their slow shift towards stability. The man in dark clothes had not moved. He was still watching her. She was recapping the needle and checking the drip rate when the outer door of the trauma bay opened and 2 men entered. Different from hospital staff. Different from the police officers she had passed in the corridor. These men moved through the doorway the way people moved through doorways when they had decided in advance that nothing inside would stop them. Federal ID. She caught the flash of it from across the bay. Behind them, at the edge of her peripheral vision, she was aware of more activity in the corridor, the distinctive sound of boots on linoleum tile, organized and numerous, the kind of footfall that did not belong in a hospital at 2 a.m. The man in dark clothes near the gurney finally moved. He stepped toward the federal agents, said something in a voice too low for her to catch, and both men stopped and looked, not at him, but at her. She finished checking the drip rate. She set down the used packaging in the waste container. She turned to assess the patient's color, which was already slightly better than it had been 30 seconds ago, and found that he was still watching her. His lips moved. She leaned slightly closer. He said a name. Not her name, not Dara Miles, the name on her nursing license and her lease agreement and her utility bills. He said a different name. 2 syllables. A designation rather than a given name. The kind of thing that was assigned rather than chosen. The name she had not heard spoken aloud in 4 years. She kept her face neutral. She was very good at keeping her face neutral. From the doorway, one of the federal agents said, "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step out of the bay and come with us." "As soon as my patient is stable," she said. There was a pause. "Ma'am, as soon as my patient is stable." She did not turn around. Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, ma'am," the agent said. In the doorway behind him, Marcus Vale stood watching the scene unfold with the expression of a man who had just realized several moves too late that he had been playing a game whose actual stakes he had never understood. The rain continued to hammer the windows of the trauma bay. The monitor beeped steadily, the numbers climbing toward acceptable. The man on the gurney kept his eyes on Dara Miles, and something in his expression had moved past pain and past fear into something that looked, from a certain angle, like recognition, like relief, like the specific relief of a person who has been found by someone they had not dared to hope would be there. She checked the line. She checked his pupils. She updated the fluid rate, handed Ferris a precise set of monitoring instructions that she knew he would follow because he had always been competent when given direction. And then she straightened up and turned toward the door. The federal agents were still waiting. So was the man in dark clothing, who had pulled a phone from his jacket and was speaking into it with a quiet intensity that told her the call was going upward, fast, through channels she recognized the shape of, even if she could not hear the words. She walked toward the door. She did not look at Vale. She didn't need to. She could feel the specific quality of his silence behind her, the silence of a man standing in a room that had just rearranged itself around him in a way he did not yet comprehend but was beginning, with deep and sickening clarity, to suspect. In the corridor beyond the bay, more boots, more dark clothing, a command structure assembling itself in the linoleum-floored hallways of a civilian hospital in Harlow City, moving with the quiet, methodical precision of people who had been briefed on a specific target and had just found something adjacent to that target that required an immediate revision of their operational priorities. One of the agents held the bay door open for her. She stepped through. And from down the corridor, through the thinning crowd of hospital staff pressed against the walls, she saw him. An older man in a military uniform she had not seen in 4 years, standing at the nurse's station with a phone to his ear and a face that was working very hard to conceal the fact that he had just experienced something he had not expected. He looked up. Their eyes met. He lowered the phone from his ear slowly. Outside, the helicopters were still running, their rotors audible through the walls and windows of Mercy Crest Medical Center, beating steadily in the rain-soaked dark, waiting. His name was Colonel Aaron Briggs, and the last time Dara Miles had seen him, she had been on one knee in the red dirt of a place she was not allowed to name, pressing a field dressing into a wound that should have killed the man beside her while Briggs stood 10 feet away and told her to hold the perimeter with her left hand because her right one was already occupied, keeping someone alive. She had held it. That was the kind of thing she did not think about during the day. Only occasionally at 3 a.m., and only when the rain was loud enough. He walked toward her now, with the measured pace of a man who was working very hard not to move faster, and she understood that the effort was not for her benefit, but for the benefit of everyone watching. The hospital staff flattened against the corridor walls, the federal agents bracketing her on both sides, the 2 Harlow City police officers who had retreated to the far end of the hallway and were doing the professional courtesy of pretending to look elsewhere. "Miles," he said. "Colonel." He stopped 2 feet from her. His eyes moved over her face with the quick, thorough assessment of someone who had spent decades reading people for signs of damage before they admitted to any. She had done the same to him in the same instant. The lines that hadn't been there 4 years ago. The additional gray at his temples. A tension around his jaw that suggested the last several hours had been significantly worse than bad. You're the one who placed the central line. He needed one. Who cleared you to re-enter the facility? Nobody. She held his gaze. The door was open. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, contained immediately by the weight of everything else happening around them. We have a lot to talk about, he said. I know. She glanced toward the trauma bay. Not yet. He followed her look, nodded once. Not yet. They put her in a family consultation room on the second floor, windowless, 4 chairs, a table with a box of tissues that nobody ever used for their intended purpose. One of the federal agents stood outside the closed door. She could hear him breathing through the gap at the bottom. She sat. She did not pace. Pacing was for people who had not already decided what they were going to say. She had been deciding for 4 years. What she had not decided was how much of it to hand over voluntarily versus how much to wait to be asked. There was a difference, tactically, between the two approaches, and the right choice depended on information she did not yet have, specifically how much they already knew, and how much of what had happened tonight was planned versus improvised. The man on the gurney, she kept returning to him. He had used her designation. That meant he was cleared at a level that gave him access to records she had been told were sealed. It also meant he had known, before tonight, who she was, which suggested that her presence at Mercy Crest was either a coincidence that someone very high up had decided to leave alone, or it had been monitored. Neither option was comfortable. The door opened. Briggs came in alone, which surprised her. He sat across from her and put a plain folder on the table between them, but did not open it. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who was going to say something he had been rehearsing and had then decided against it. "How long have you been here?" he said. "At this hospital." 4 years. You know we had you in Nevada. I know. You moved without notifying the transition office. I transitioned out of the program, Colonel, civilian life. My understanding was that the notification obligation moved with my contract, and my contract ended. He looked at her steadily. That's a very precise reading of the terms. I had time to read carefully. He opened the folder then. She caught a partial view of the top sheet, but not a personnel document, which she had expected, but something with a different header, a different classification stamp. The man in Bay 2, Briggs said. Richard Voss, Deputy Director of Interagency Medical Intelligence. 61 years old, 17 years in the position. He paused. He was being transported under secondary cover for a classified procedure scheduled for a facility in Colorado Springs when his condition deteriorated faster than projected. The decision was made to divert to the nearest Level 2 trauma center, which was Mercy Crest. Yes? She processed this. Who made that call? Logistics, automated triage protocol. It's a system, not a person. Then the system didn't know that the ER physician on duty tonight would spend 8 critical minutes not running a central line because he was managing a staffing dispute. The words came out flatter than she intended. Not angry. She was past anger and had been for some time, but the flatness carried its own weight, and Briggs heard it. His jaw tightened briefly. No, he said. The system didn't know that. Voss is going to be fine, she said. The line's running. His pressure was stabilizing when I left the bay, but the window was narrower than it should have been. I know. He closed the folder. Dara, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. The documentation you kept while you were here. He said it carefully, watching her face. We're going to need it. She had expected this too. Not this quickly, but eventually. What happened tonight, she said. The helicopters, the federal agents. That isn't just about Voss's transport being diverted to a civilian hospital. It wasn't a question. Briggs didn't treat it as one. There was a security breach, he said, 3 weeks ago. Information regarding Voss's medical status and travel schedule was accessed from an external point. We've spent 3 weeks trying to locate the source. He stopped. Let the implication sit there in the silence between them. She felt it land. You think it originated from here. We think the breach point was someone with access to Mercy Crest's administrative network, someone who pulled patient intake data over the past 6 months and cross-referenced it with external sources to build a movement pattern for VIP medical transports through the region. He paused again. It's a very sophisticated methodology. It is, she agreed. The kind of thing someone would need specific training to construct. She looked at him. Say what you came here to say, Colonel. There are people upstairs right now, not my people, who are going to suggest that your presence here was not incidental, that you engineered your own termination tonight to avoid scrutiny. The words settled in the room like something physical. I see, she said. I'm not one of those people. I know. She paused. But you came in here alone to warn me before they did, which tells me their theory has enough traction that it needed to be neutralized in advance. Briggs was quiet for a moment. You always did that, he said, not critically, just observationally. 3 moves ahead. It's how I stayed alive. Yes. He looked at the folder, then back at her. The documentation, can you access it from here? I can access it from anywhere. She pulled out her phone. But I want something in return. Dara, not for me, for the record. She set the phone on the table. Whatever investigation opens out of tonight, Voss's breach, this hospital, any of it, I want every piece of what I documented over the past 14 months included in scope, not as evidence against me, as evidence of what happened in this building before tonight. He met her eyes. You're talking about Vale. I'm talking about a pattern of conduct that contributed to patient harm on at least 2 documented occasions that I can prove, and that created the exact kind of institutional dysfunction that makes a facility like this vulnerable to the things you're worried about. She paused. Someone was negligent tonight. That negligence almost killed a man you came here specifically to protect. That is not a separate conversation from everything else. Briggs sat with that. He was not the kind of man who rushed to answer, which was one of the things she had respected about him. All right, he said. All right meaning it's in scope, or all right meaning you'll try? Meaning it's in scope. He picked up the folder. I have to go back up there. We'll do this properly in about 20 minutes. He stood. He was almost at the door when he stopped without turning around. You know Voss recognized you, he said. I know. He asked about you before he went under. By designation. A beat. I thought you should know that he asked. She did not answer. There was nothing to answer. She looked at the wall and listened to the door close behind him, and sat with the particular feeling of a life she had worked very hard to set down, being picked back up again. Not by her own choice, not by her own hands, but by the specific gravity of things that were not finished yet and had apparently decided to prove it. 20 minutes became 40. She used the time. She pulled every file she had compiled over 14 months and organized it into a single transfer package. Not her usual system, which was built for her own reference, but a forensic presentation built for people who would not give her the benefit of any doubt and who would need to find each piece of evidence exactly where she said it was. She labeled everything. She included her own contemporaneous notes, the timestamps, the post-operative report she had accessed with Dr. Sohal's documented observations about the delay in the Trevor Oakes case, and 17 other incidents across 14 months that ranged from documentation failures to what she was comfortable calling a deliberate pattern of dismissal with patient safety consequences. She was finishing the index when the door opened, and it was not Briggs. 2 people entered. A woman in her late 40s in a dark suit who introduced herself as Agent Cora Lint from what she described only as an interagency oversight division, and a man roughly the same age in civilian clothes who gave his name as Warren Ashby and described his role as administrative liaison, which told Dara precisely nothing and was almost certainly designed to. They sat. Lint put a recording device on the table and looked at Dara with the specific expression of a person who had been briefed to be skeptical. Ms. Miles, we're going to be straightforward with you. I'd appreciate that, Dara said. Your presence in this facility tonight is irregular. You were terminated earlier this evening. Your access should have been revoked, and you reinserted yourself into an active medical situation involving a classified patient without any authorization. That's accurate? Lint paused. Apparently she had expected more resistance. You don't dispute that. I dispute the implication. I don't dispute the facts. Dara set her phone on the table, screen up, the transfer package visible. Deputy Director Voss arrived at this facility with inadequate IV access and a deteriorating pressure profile. The attending physician on duty had a documented history of delaying intervention on patients whose deterioration I had identified before the monitoring equipment flagged it. I made a judgment call. Voss is alive and stable. I'm willing to defend that judgment in any form you'd like. Ashby leaned forward slightly. That's not the only question on the table. I know what the other question is. She looked at him directly. You want to know if I had any connection to the breach that led to Voss's transport schedule being compromised? The answer is no. What I have, she tapped the phone, is 14 months of documentation about this hospital's administrative and clinical failures that has nothing to do with Voss and everything to do with the reason this facility was structurally compromised in ways that go beyond a single security incident. Lint and Ashby exchanged a look. It was fast, professional, and told her they had not expected the documentation to already exist in a transferable format. You were prepared for this, Lint said. Not quite an accusation. I was prepared to protect myself from a wrongful termination, Dara said. What you choose to use it for is your business. The questioning lasted another hour and 20 minutes. It was thorough. Lint was good. She came back at angles, circled questions, listened carefully to the places where Dara's answers were brief, and pushed at them with follow-up. Dara answered everything she was asked and volunteered nothing she hadn't already decided to offer. She did not perform cooperativeness. She simply was cooperative, which was different, and Lint was experienced enough to notice the difference. At the end, Lint asked one more question. The designation Voss used when he recognized you, you're aware of what it indicates in terms of your operational history? Yes. And you understand that the records associated with that designation are classified? I'm aware of their classification. Then you understand why we need to know. Lint stopped, selected her words. When you left the program, was it voluntary? The question had weight behind it that Dara did not miss. It was not a bureaucratic question. Yes, Dara said, completely. There was no coercion, no external pressure, no arrangement of any kind regarding your transition? She looked at Lint steadily. Something in the framing of those questions told her there was a specific answer they were worried about, a specific scenario that someone had proposed as a possibility, or had perhaps alleged. Is there a reason you're asking those questions in that sequence? Dara said. A pause. Standard protocol. Those are not standard protocol questions. Lint held her gaze for a moment. Then she picked up the recording device and turned it off. No, she said. They're not. She put the device in her jacket. There's a statement in our file. It was submitted 6 weeks ago, anonymously, alleging that your separation from the program was arranged as part of a placement, that your presence at this facility was deliberate and operational. The room was very quiet. Someone told you I was planted here, Dara said. Someone alleged it. We have not validated the claim. Lint was watching her carefully. The timing of tonight's events made it a priority question. Dara sat back. She was thinking about the timeline. 6 weeks ago, someone had filed that allegation. 6 weeks ago, she had escalated her documentation after the Trevor Oaks incident. 6 weeks ago, Vale had begun the formal complaint process that culminated in tonight's termination. Who submitted it? She said. Lint said nothing. But Ashby's eyes moved, just briefly, without intention. A micro shift toward the door, toward the floor below them, toward the general direction of the emergency department where Marcus Vale was, presumably still on duty, or still on the premises, or being asked questions of his own. Dara did not need Lint to answer. She already had what she needed. They let her out of the room just before 4 a.m. The corridor had changed in character. Less chaos, more controlled activity, the specific organized stillness of an operation that had moved from emergency response into documentation mode. People with tablets, people with phones, people speaking in the clipped shorthand of professionals who were building a record. Briggs found her at the end of the hall. "Voss is out of immediate danger," he said. "Surgery's been flagged, but the current assessment is that it may not be necessary." "Good." He walked beside her toward the elevator. "Lint talked to you about the anonymous filing." "Yes." "Do you know who submitted it?" "I have a reasonable hypothesis." He was quiet for a moment. "The filing is going to complicate things for you, even if it's disproved." "I know." "There are people who will use it regardless of the evidence. The allegation itself becomes the narrative for anyone who wants one." "I know that too." She stopped at the elevator, looked at him. 14 months ago, I walked into this hospital, and every day after that I documented what I saw, because I understood that one day I would need a record that stood on its own without requiring anyone to take my word for anything. She pressed the button. "That's what I have. That's what I came here with. Whatever anyone files against me, the record answers it." The elevator arrived. She stepped in. Briggs put his hand against the door to hold it. "Dara," he paused, "the people whose lives you saved, in the field, Voss knows their names. He's been carrying them for years." She looked at him, said nothing. "He's going to want to talk to you when he's well enough." "I know. And there are others." He held her eyes. "This isn't over tonight." The door began to push against his hand. He let it go. As the elevator closed, she caught one last glimpse of the corridor, the federal agents, the organized activity, the hospital staff watching from the edges of their own building like guests at a party that had been taken over by people they didn't recognize. And at the far end, just visible through the gap in the closing doors, Marcus Vale standing outside the trauma bay with a federal agent on each side of him and no expression on his face that she could read from this distance. But she did not need to read his face. The elevator descended, and from somewhere above, through the floors and the walls and the rain still hammering the roof, she could hear the sound of her phone buzzing in her pocket. One notification, then two, then a sequence that told her the transfer package had been accessed. Not by Lint, not yet. By a classification level she had not expected to see tonight, from a server address that meant someone was reading her documentation from inside the Pentagon at 4:06 in the morning in real time. She stared at the notification. The elevator doors opened into the lobby. She did not move. She stood in the elevator doorway for 3 seconds, long enough for the doors to attempt to close and bounce off her shoulder, then stepped back inside and let them shut. She looked at the notification again. The server address was not something a civilian would recognize. It was formatted as a routine cloud sync, the kind of timestamp that would scroll past unnoticed on anyone's phone if they hadn't spent years learning to read what was behind the formatting. She had learned. The address resolved to a routing node she knew by a different name, one that didn't appear in any public directory, one that belonged to a department whose official budget line described it as Administrative Infrastructure Support. Someone in that department was reading her files at 4:06 a.m. She rode the elevator back up. Briggs was still in the corridor, now on his phone, and he looked up when she reappeared with an expression that shifted from mild surprise to attention in about half a second. She showed him the notification without explaining it, watched his face. He looked at it, looked at her. His jaw did the thing it did when he was processing something he had not anticipated and was deciding how much of that to show. "When did this start?" he said. "The access. Just now, while I was in the elevator." "Does Lint know you have server-level read notifications on your transfer package?" "She knows I transferred the files. She doesn't know how I built the package." Dara put the phone back in her pocket. Who in that office would be awake at this hour reading a nurse's employment documentation? Briggs was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who didn't know, the quiet of someone deciding what they were authorized to say. "Someone flagged your name," he said finally, "before tonight. The anonymous filing Lint mentioned. It didn't just go to the oversight division. It was cross-referenced against active personnel files by an automated system, and when the system found a match, it generated an alert to a secondary office." "What kind of match?" "Your designation, Nightingale 1. He said it the way people said things they were not comfortable saying out loud in a hospital corridor at 4 a.m. The system flagged it as a potential unauthorized identity disclosure, which triggered a secondary review, which is still open." He paused. which means someone at that office has had your name on a priority list for 6 weeks. She processed this carefully. The filing and the review aren't separate threads. No. Someone filed the anonymous allegation specifically to trigger the automated flag, knowing the flag would open a secondary review, knowing that a secondary review would put my name in front of people who would start looking at my history. Briggs looked at the floor briefly. That's the operational reading, yes. Which means the point wasn't to plant me. The point was to expose me. She said it evenly. Not with anger, because anger was not useful, but with the clinical precision of someone who had just identified the actual mechanism. Someone wanted my classified history surfaced through official channels without getting their hands near it directly. That's what the secondary office is trying to determine. And Voss's transport being diverted here tonight. We don't know yet whether that was coincidental, but you don't think it was. He met her eyes. No, I don't think it was. The corridor was quieter now, the organized activity having migrated toward the administrative wing and the trauma bay. One of the federal agents was 20 feet away, not looking at them, which in Dara's experience meant he was very much listening. I need to see Voss, she said. He's not cleared for visitors. I'm not a visitor. She held Briggs' gaze. Whoever built this, whatever this is, they used my history to set it in motion. Voss is the only person in this building who knows that history from the inside. If someone wanted him in this specific facility at this specific time, there's a reason, and it isn't about his medical transport. Briggs was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted. 10 minutes, he said. I'll walk you in. The trauma bay had been reconfigured in the 90 minutes since she'd left it. The crash energy was gone, replaced by the quieter machinery of post-stabilization monitoring. Softer beeps, slower movement, the particular stillness of a space that had been through something and was now cataloging the aftermath. Voss was elevated 15 degrees on the gurney, an oxygen cannula in place, both arms monitored, the central line she had placed still running at the rate she had set. The resident Ferris was at the monitor station in the corner, and he looked up when she entered with the expression of someone trying to determine whether her presence was permitted or whether he would need to make a phone call. Briggs's presence answered that question. Ferris looked back at his monitor. Voss was awake. That was more than she had expected at this hour. His color was better. Not good, but moving in the right direction. And his eyes tracked to her immediately when she crossed to the right side of the gurney. She checked the line, checked the drip rate, checked the monitor display in the same automatic sequence she had used 100 times in conditions where the room was moving and someone was shooting at the walls outside. You look better than you did an hour ago, she said. Low bar. His voice was rough but present. Briggs tells me I have you to thank for the IV. Briggs is being generous. You had a team. Briggs tells me the physician on duty needed convincing. She didn't answer that. It wasn't the conversation she'd come for. Deputy Director Voss, she said, you knew my designation. I need to know what else you knew before tonight. He looked at her for a moment. His breathing was still careful, the measured inflation of someone working around something that hurt. But his eyes were sharp in a way that pain hadn't fully reached yet. I knew you were here, he said, in Harlow City, working at this hospital. For how long? 8 months. He paused. I knew because I was the one who approved the monitoring arrangement. She held very still. Explain that. When you transitioned out, the standard protocol was a 2-year passive monitoring period. You know that. The 2 years ended. Yes. But 6 months before the end of the passive period, we flagged an anomaly in your separation file. A notation that had been added after the fact. A recommendation. He closed his eyes briefly, not from pain, she thought, but from the difficulty of navigating what he was about to say. The notation suggested that your separation was performed under duress, that you left because you'd been pressured out, and that the pressure had originated internally. The room was very still. Someone in the program filed a false record, she said. Someone altered an existing record, added language that wasn't there at signing. He looked at her steadily. We've been trying to identify who for the past 14 months. The monitoring here wasn't about watching you. It was about watching whether anyone made contact, whether whoever altered the record would surface again. She understood the shape of it now. You were using me as bait. We were watching a situation that already existed. He said it without apology, which she preferred to the alternative. You were living your life. We were watching the perimeter around it. And 6 weeks ago, someone filed an anonymous allegation accusing me of being a plant. Yes. Which means the person you were watching decided to move first. It appears that way. He shifted slightly on the gurney and stopped immediately. The movement had cost him something. There are 2 people in this hospital who had access to the level of administrative network required to build the profile that generated the security breach on my transport. One of them has been employed here for 22 years and has no record of any clearance-adjacent activity whatsoever. She waited. The other has been employed here for 14 months, Voss said, and has a very interesting prior employment history that does not appear in the Mercy Crest HR file. She thought about the folder Lint had brought into the consultation room, the specific sequence of questions about coercion, about arrangements, about whether her separation was voluntary. Vale, she said. Voss said nothing, which was answer enough. She left the trauma bay with Briggs and stood in the corridor for a moment, doing the things she did when she needed to think clearly, standing completely still while her mind moved. It was a habit she had developed in the field, when moving gave away position and thinking was the only activity that didn't cost anything. Marcus Vale. She ran the timeline. 14 months ago, he had arrived at Mercy Crest. 14 months ago, she had begun documenting. She had assumed, without examining the assumption, that his behavior toward her was the ordinary arrogance of a physician who didn't like nurses who asked inconvenient questions. She had documented it as misconduct. She had not considered the possibility that the misconduct was deliberate, not arrogance, but pressure. Not dismissal, but a campaign designed to either drive her out of the hospital or destabilize her enough that she would become visible, would surface something she was supposed to keep buried. If Vale had access to her classified record, even a portion of it, even the notation about her separation, he would have known who she was when he arrived. He would have known what she was trying to protect, and he would have spent 14 months methodically dismantling her position at Mercy Crest, while simultaneously building the network access that allowed him to monitor Voss's medical transport schedule. The patient who had died, the Trevor Oakes case, every clinical incident she had documented as negligence. It could have been negligence, or it could have been deliberate provocation, creating conditions that would eventually produce a confrontation serious enough to get her terminated, getting her out of the building tonight, on the specific night that Voss arrived. She turned to Briggs. Where is he right now? Vale? Administrative wing. He's being questioned. Is Lint running that interview? Her team, yes. She needs to know about the altered separation record tonight. Not in the morning, not after they finish the preliminary interview. She was already moving toward the administrative wing. If he knows the monitoring arrangement was in place, he knows his window is closing. He'll have a contingency. Dara. Briggs moved with her, keeping pace. Lint is experienced. He's been building this for 14 months while everyone around him thought he was just a difficult physician. She didn't slow down. He's not going to fall apart in a standard interview. He's going to be very calm and very cooperative, and he is going to say exactly enough to make the picture look like something other than what it is. She stopped at the stairwell door. The documentation I sent, the server that accessed it at 4 a.m., that office has the altered record. That altered record places Vale inside a network that has been operating against program personnel for at least 2 years. Lint needs all of that before she walks out of that room. Briggs held the stairwell door open. His expression had moved into something harder, something that was less about her and more about whatever he was calculating. I'll make the call, he said. Now. Now. He already had his phone out. She went up the stairs. The administrative wing of Mercy Crest occupied the northeast corner of the 3rd floor, a cluster of offices and conference rooms that during business hours processed the ordinary bureaucratic life of a mid-size urban hospital and at 4:30 a.m. had become something entirely else. 2 agents were posted at the wing entrance. She walked past them with the specific posture of someone who had authorization and was not going to explain it, and one of them started to speak, and then didn't, which told her Briggs's call had preceded her by about 30 seconds. The conference room where Vale was being interviewed had a narrow window in the door. She looked through it. He was seated at the far end of the table in the same clothes he'd been wearing when she last saw him. The white coat was gone, probably taken by someone, but the shirt and tie were intact, and he had not loosened the tie. That detail registered. A man being questioned under pressure for several hours in a hot room who had not loosened his tie was performing composure rather than feeling it. Lint was across from him with a second agent beside her. Vale was speaking. She could not hear the words through the door, but she could read the cadence. Measured, unhurried, articulate. The cadence of someone who had prepared for this conversation and was delivering prepared material. She watched his hands, left hand flat on the table, still, right hand occasionally lifting to gesture, controlled, deliberate. The left hand was the tell. Completely motionless people were not calm. They were controlled. Calm people moved naturally. Still hands were held still. He knew he was being watched. Not through the door. He couldn't see the door from his position, but in the general sense of a person who understood that every motion was being recorded and had adjusted accordingly. She pulled out her phone and opened the transfer package. She found the section she wanted, the documentation from 11 weeks ago, a Wednesday afternoon, an administrative overlap window when she had been on the floor for a double shift and had covered the nursing station for 20 minutes while the charge nurse was in a supply meeting. She had not included this section in the primary transfer because she had not understood its significance at the time. Vale had received a phone call at the nursing station landline. She had not answered it. It was his line. But she had seen the number on the display before he came to take it, and she had written it down the way she wrote everything down, out of reflex, out of training, out of the particular discipline of someone who had learned that the thing you couldn't explain today often explained everything later. She had never looked up the number. She looked it up now at 4:33 a.m., using a directory that was not publicly available and that she had retained access to by virtue of a technical oversight in the decommissioning of her program credentials that she had never reported and had never used until this moment. The number resolved in 11 seconds. She looked at the result. She looked at it for a long moment. Standing in the corridor outside the room where Marcus Vale was performing composure for two federal agents who did not yet have the piece of information currently sitting on her phone screen. The number belonged to an administrative office associated with the same routing node that had accessed her transfer package at 4:06 a.m. The same secondary office. The same department whose official budget line described it as Administrative Infrastructure Support, which meant Vale had not been the architect of this. He had been the instrument, someone inside the program, inside the structure that had employed her, that had trained her, that had sealed her records and monitored her perimeter and altered her separation file, had been running Marcus Vale the same way they had been running everything else. And that person had accessed her documentation within minutes of its transfer from inside the building that was supposed to be protecting the information she had spent 14 months compiling. She looked up from her phone. At the end of the corridor, 30 feet away, Colonel Aaron Briggs was standing with his phone at his side, not raised to his ear, not actively in use, standing still in the way he always stood when he was thinking. But he was looking at her, and in his expression, under the practiced steadiness, there was something she had only seen on his face once before, in a red dirt field, in the 3 seconds before the second strike hit, when he had known what was coming and had known there was nothing left to do but hold the position. She looked at the phone in her hand. She looked at the routing node address. She looked at the timestamp of the access, 4:06 a.m. She looked at Briggs. He had left her in the elevator at 4:03. He had been alone in the corridor for 3 minutes. Her phone was still in her hand. The screen was still lit. The number was still there, connecting every thread of the past 14 months to a single point of origin that was standing 30 feet away from her in a hospital corridor at 4:35 in the morning, watching her with the expression of a man who had just watched someone find the thing he had spent years making sure would never be found. She did not move. That was the first decision, the one that happened before conscious thought, the instinct that had kept her alive in situations where the wrong first movement cost everything. She stood in the corridor with the phone in her hand and her face neutral and her eyes on Briggs, and she let the moment exist without filling it. He was watching her read him. He knew she had found something. He could not know exactly what she had found, but he was looking at her face the way a person looked when they were calculating how much time they had left before a situation became unrecoverable, and the answer was arriving as a number smaller than they had prepared for. She put the phone in her pocket. She walked toward him, not fast, not slow. The same pace she used crossing a floor toward a patient who needed to believe she was not alarmed, because the moment they saw alarm in her face, it would travel into their body and make everything harder. She had walked across a lot of floors. She knew how to control what her feet communicated. Briggs watched her come. His left hand moved slightly at his side. Not toward anything, just the micro-adjustment of a person's weight shifting, the body's answer to a threat it had clocked before the mind had fully named it. She stopped 4 feet from him. "The secondary office," she said quietly, "the one that accessed my files at 4:06. You know what it is." "Dara, you've known what it is since before tonight, since before you came to this hospital." She kept her voice even. Below the level of the agent at the end of the corridor. "I need to know if you're running me or if you're protecting me, and I need to know right now, because those are 2 different conversations and I am not having the wrong one." Briggs looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing the thing it did when he was deciding. The specific flatness that meant the calculation was running underneath, and the expression was a placeholder. "Both," he said. It was not the answer she had expected, or rather, it was exactly the answer she had feared, which was different from expecting it. "Explain that," she said. "Not here." He glanced toward the agent at the corridor entrance. "There's a room. I'm not going into another room with you until I understand what I'm walking into." "I know." He exhaled slowly, the exhale of someone releasing a decision rather than a breath. "The secondary office is a division I've reported to for the past 3 years. It operates under the infrastructure support designation because that's the cover designation for counter-internal operations. We identify and monitor individuals within cleared structures who are running unauthorized agendas against program personnel." He paused. "I was assigned to your case 14 months ago, when Vale arrived at this hospital." She processed this. "You sent Vale here?" "No. Vale was already being positioned. Someone else sent Vale here." He held her eyes. "My job was to watch what he did and build a case that would survive a classified review, which required leaving the situation operational long enough to document the full network, which required leaving me in it." She said it without inflection. Knowing what he was doing, knowing it was deliberate. "Yes." The word sat between them like something dropped on a hard floor. She looked at him. She thought about 14 months. She thought about the Trevor Oakes case and the documented delay and the post-operative notes she had pulled with such careful, precise thoroughness, believing she was building her own protection. She thought about every night she had walked out of Mercy Crest and gotten into her gray truck and driven home in the specific solitude of a person who had chosen to be alone with a secret, not knowing that the secret had been known all along. That her careful, private documentation had been the operation itself, not a separate act of survival. "The patient who died," she said. "The man with the ruptured spleen. You knew Vale was going to delay. We didn't know the specific incident. We knew the pattern." "You knew the pattern." Her voice remained even. The evenness was effort, but she had spent years on effort. "A man died as part of your operational timeline." Briggs did not look away. That, at least. "Yes." She stood with that. She was not going to perform what she felt about it, because this was not the time, and because the feeling itself was a complex thing, not simple rage, but something more structural, the specific grief of someone who understood that she had been used as an instrument without being told she was one, by a person she had trusted in a way she didn't trust most people. "Who's Vale's handler?" she said. "That's what tonight was supposed to establish." "Was supposed to." The transport diversion wasn't in our plan. Voss's arrival here accelerated everything. Whoever is running Vale made a move. We don't know yet if that move was getting Voss into this hospital or if the diversion was genuinely logistical and they improvised around it. Briggs's voice was tight in a way she hadn't heard before. The tightness of someone operating outside the margins of their prepared scenario. When Voss used your designation, that wasn't supposed to happen. That exposed you in a way that forces the handler's hand regardless of what we intended. Because now my record is going to come out. Through Lindt's investigation. Officially. Yes. Which is what the anonymous filing was designed to achieve in the first place. She saw it fully now. Whoever is running this, they filed the allegation, they positioned Vale to destabilize my situation here, and they arranged or improvised Voss's arrival specifically to get my classified history surfaced through an official channel. Officially surfaced, officially associated with this security breach, officially on record. She paused. They want my history attached to tonight's incident as evidence of something. As evidence that the Nightingale 1 program itself was compromised, Briggs said. If they can establish that a program asset was operating in a civilian hospital in proximity to a classified VYP breach, the entire program comes under review. 14 years of operation, 63 personnel, every case, every record, every asset currently in the field. The scope of it arrived in full. They're not after me, she said. I'm the mechanism. You were always the mechanism. The question is whose mechanism? She thought about the routing node, the server address, the number that had resolved on her phone, the call to Vale's nursing station line 11 weeks ago. The access at 4:06, she said. That was you. Yes. You accessed my transfer package from the corridor. I needed to know what you had sent before Lindt's team began pulling threads. He said it without apology, the same way Voss had spoken, not cold, but honest in the way that people were honest when they had already weighed the cost of dishonesty and found it higher. I needed to know if you had inadvertently included material that would surface the counter-internal operation before we were ready. And had I? No. Your documentation was exactly what you said it was. 14 months of clinical and administrative misconduct evidence. He paused. It was also the most thorough civilian documentation of a physician-level internal threat I have seen in 20 years of this work. You built a case that will hold in any forum. I wasn't building it for you. I know. He looked at her. That's why it holds. She made a decision. It was not a comfortable one, and she did not dress it up as anything other than what it was. A tactical choice made with incomplete information in a situation where waiting for complete information was not an available option. She was going to use him, the same way he had used her, but with the significant difference that she was going to tell him she was doing it. Here's what happens next, she said. You go back to Lindt. You give her everything you just told me. The counter-internal operation, Vale's handler, the secondary office, all of it, on record, tonight. That exposes the operation. The operation is already exposed. Whoever is running Vale has been watching this building for the past 4 hours. They know Voss is alive. They know I'm here. They are currently adjusting their plan, and every minute that Lindt's team operates without the full picture is a minute that adjustment has room to run. She held his gaze. The only thing that neutralizes this tonight is full disclosure to the oversight investigation. Everything. Which means your operation, your involvement, and the question of who positioned Vale here and why. Briggs was quiet. It means I'll be asked why I left you in a situation I knew was engineered, he said. On record. Yes. That's not a small thing. I know it isn't. She did not soften it. Go talk to Lindt. He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. A single, deliberate nod. And walked toward the conference room at the end of the corridor, and she watched him go. And she did not feel triumphant about any of it, because triumph required a certain uncomplicated relationship with the outcome, and this outcome was not uncomplicated. She pulled out her phone and made a call she had been composing in her head for the past 10 minutes. A number she had memorized rather than stored, belonging to a person she had spoken to once in the past 4 years, a former program legal officer named Stein, who had left the division 2 years ago and was now in private practice in Washington with a very specific client base and an extremely unlisted number. He answered on the third ring. It was nearly 5 a.m. It's Miles, she said. A pause. I wondered when. I need a legal observer present for an interagency interview before 6 a.m. tonight. Where? She told him. 40 minutes, he said, and hung up. Touch up. What happened in the next 2 hours was not orderly, and she would not remember it as orderly later. She would remember it as a series of pressure points, moments where the shape of the situation changed and required immediate recalibration, connected by corridors and conference rooms, and the persistent sound of rain against institutional windows and the smell of hospital coffee that nobody was drinking. Briggs walked into the room with Lint at 4:51 a.m. and came out 40 minutes later looking like a man who had handed over something heavy and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. Lint came out 7 minutes after him and looked at Dara with an expression that had shed the professional skepticism and replaced it with something harder and more focused. "I need everything you have on the routing node," Lint said. Dara gave it to her. All of it. The server address, the directory result, the phone number from 11 weeks ago and where it resolved, the timestamp sequence that connected the access to Briggs's position in the corridor. She gave it without editorializing because the material was coherent on its own, and people who were good at their jobs did not need her to narrate conclusions for them. Lint took it and went back inside. Stein arrived at 5:47 a.m. in a suit that suggested he had already been dressed when she called, which told her either he kept unusual hours or he had been expecting this call for longer than tonight. He was 61, compact, precise in the way that lawyers who had spent 20 years in classified proceedings were precise, careful with words, fast with assessments, and entirely comfortable with the specific kind of institutional ugliness that the rest of the world preferred to believe didn't exist. She briefed him in the corridor in 6 minutes. He asked 4 questions. Each one was the right question. "You're not the target," he said when she finished. "You know that." "I know that now." "They want the program. You're the thread they pull to unravel it." He looked toward the conference rooms. "Who's running Veil is the question everything depends on. Do you have a hypothesis?" "I have a routing node and a phone number and 14 months of a physician's conduct that doesn't match any civilian profile." She paused. "I have a secondary office that ran a counter-internal operation for 3 years without surfacing a handler, which means either the handler is very good or the handler is inside the secondary office." Stein was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant allegation," he said. "It's a significant situation." He looked at her with the assessment of someone who had spent decades reading people in adversarial contexts. "All right," he said. "Let's go make it official." The formal interview began at 6:10 a.m. with Stein present, with a second agent Lint had called in from a field office 40 minutes outside Harlow City, and with a recording protocol that Stein reviewed and approved before Dara answered a single question. The room was too cold. The coffee someone brought was burnt. Dara's hands had a slight tremor that she was aware of and that she kept below the surface by keeping them flat on the table, the way Vale had, though for different reasons. She answered everything. She was specific. She was sequential. She named dates and times from memory, which consistently matched the documentation she had provided, which she knew impressed Lint in the particular way that precision impressed people who dealt daily in imprecision. At 7:22 a.m., she said the thing she had been building toward. "The handler is not external," she said. "The routing node that accessed my files. It resolves inside the secondary office's own infrastructure, not to the office, to a personal device running through the office's server. Someone used the office's own routing to mask access that originated from within it." Lint was still. "The counter-internal operation that Briggs was running," Dara continued, "someone inside that operation was running the opposite operation simultaneously, using the counter-internal framework as cover for the internal threat it was supposed to be detecting." The room was very quiet. "That's a specific claim," the second agent said. "Yes." She looked at Lint. "The phone number from 11 weeks ago, the one that resolved to the secondary office. Can you pull the personal device assignments for that node from the past 6 months?" Lint looked at the second agent. Something passed between them. "We can," Lint said. "Then we'll have a name by this afternoon." The name arrived at 11:17 a.m. She was in the family consultation room again, the one with the tissues, eating a vending machine sandwich that tasted like the packaging it came in, when Lint knocked and opened the door without waiting for an answer, which was the first signal. The second was that Stein, who had been reviewing documents in the corner, looked up from the page and did not look back down. The name was not someone she recognized. A program administrator named Harlan So, mid-level, 12 years in the secondary office, who had spent the past 4 years building a private channel inside an oversight operation and using it to systematically identify, surveil, and compromise former field personnel whose records represented liability to a network of undisclosed contractors who had been operating in the same regions during the same periods as the people he was monitoring. It was not a spy novel operation. It was a bureaucratic one, slow, methodical, designed to function invisibly inside the machinery of the very office tasked with detecting it. So had moved Vale into position. He had filed the anonymous allegation. He had accessed her files at 4:06 a.m. from inside the building on a personal device through a routing mask he had built himself over the course of 2 years. He had been in the building since midnight. As a civilian observer attached to Lint's team, he was currently in the hospital. "Where?" Dara said. "He was in the administrative wing 20 minutes ago," Lint said. "We're locating him now. Check the 3rd floor, the stairwell exits, and the service corridor." She was already standing. If he knows his device has been pulled, he moves. And he knows this building's layout because he's had access to the facility records. Lint spoke into her radio. Dara did not wait for the response. She went into the corridor with Stein behind her, telling her to stop, and she did not stop, because this part she understood, and the rest of them were still catching up. She had been in this building for 4 years. She had memorized its layout the way she memorized everything. Not deliberately, but because that was how her mind worked, recording spatial information automatically and filing it in the place reserved for things that might one day matter. She knew the service corridor ran parallel to the administrative wing and exited onto the east stairwell, which fed directly to the loading dock on the ground level. She knew the loading dock door had a delayed security response, 30 seconds between badge read and lock confirmation, because she had been on a committee 2 years ago that discussed upgrading it, and the upgrade had not been funded. She went down the stairs. The loading dock was gray and utilitarian and smelled of disinfectant and diesel from the vehicles that idled there during supply deliveries. At this hour, it was mostly empty. 2 hospital maintenance workers with a utility cart at the far end, and a man in a dark civilian jacket moving toward the external door, with the pace of someone who was not running but was covering distance as efficiently as someone running could. He was slightly built, middle-aged, with the unremarkable appearance of a person who had spent years deliberately cultivating unremarkability. She would not have picked him out in a crowd. That was presumably the point. "Soe," she said. He stopped, turned. He looked at her with the assessment of a man who was calculating odds in real time. And the calculation was not going well, and he knew it, and he was doing the thing that people did when they had run out of options, deciding what face to put on the moment before it closed. "You were faster than I expected," he said. "I had good documentation." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. 14 months of it. I read every page." "I know, 4:06 a.m. She took one step toward him. "You built a very sophisticated operation and ran it for 4 years, and you made one mistake." "Just one?" "The phone call to this hospital 11 weeks ago, to a landline. You used the office routing because you were in the building and it was the path of least resistance. You thought it was clean." She paused. "It was clean for everything except a nurse who wrote down numbers she couldn't explain because that was what she'd been trained to do." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not into remorse, nothing so human as that, but into a kind of recognition. The recognition of someone who had built an architecture against a specific threat and had miscalculated the nature of the threat itself. "The program is going to be reviewed," he said. "Regardless of tonight, there are enough contractors with enough exposure that this was always going to surface eventually." "Maybe. You understand that, right? This doesn't end with me." He said it without desperation, just a statement, the way a person stated a weather forecast. "There are 12 other nodes, 12 other personnel files with alterations, 12 other situations running parallel to yours." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's why you're going to give Lint's team every name." The external door opened behind him. 2 federal agents came through it. A third appeared from the internal entrance to her left. Lint was behind that one. So looked at the room for a moment, the configuration of it, the closed options. And then he looked at Dara with an expression that was almost, but not quite, respect. The almost version, the one that people arrived at when they had underestimated someone and were now in the process of revising every assumption they had made. "The designation suits you," he said. "Nightingale 1. "I didn't choose it," she said. The agents reached him. He did not resist. He put his hands behind his back with the precise, unhurried movement of a man who had planned for this contingency and had decided, in the end, that resistance to the physical inevitability of it was not worth the energy. Lint came to stand beside Dara. They watched the agents walk Soe toward the internal corridor, toward the paperwork and the proceedings, and the long institutional reckoning that would take years to complete and would never be tidy. 12 others, Lint said quietly. "He'll give them to you," Dara said. "He's pragmatic. He knows what he has to trade." "You sound sure." "I've been reading people in crisis for a long time." She paused. "When they've already lost the thing they were protecting, they don't protect the architecture. They negotiate." Lint nodded slowly. "We're going to need you for the formal deposition. It'll take days." "I know." "And the program review." "I know that too." Lint glanced at her sideways. "You're very calm for someone who just spent 14 months being used as operational bait without knowing it." "I wasn't calm 3 hours ago." Dara looked at the door So had been walked through. "I'm calm now because the thing I built held up. All of it. Every page, every timestamp, every observation I wrote down and backed up and organized for 14 months. She exhaled slowly. "I spent 4 years trying to be ordinary, and it didn't work. So I built a record instead. That's what I know how to do." Lint was quiet for a moment. "Dr. Vale is in federal custody as of 40 minutes ago. His legal team is already here." Dara received this without visible reaction. "And Briggs?" "Administrative leave, pending review." Lint's voice was careful. He cooperated fully. "That will matter." "Yes," Dara said. "It will." At 1:15 in the afternoon, she was escorted to the fourth-floor room where Richard Voss had been moved, a private room, monitored, with an agent outside the door who stepped aside when he saw Lint's clearance. Voss was awake, elevated, the oxygen cannula gone, color considerably better than it had been 10 hours ago. He looked, if not well, then at least present in the full sense of the word. Alert, and tracking and carrying the particular gravity of someone who had been told what had happened in the building around them while they were unconscious. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She was very tired. She had not slept. The vending machine sandwich was the only thing she had eaten since yesterday afternoon. "Briggs?" Voss said. It was not a question. "Yes." "He was protecting you." "He was protecting the operation." She paused. "There's a difference." "Not always." She looked at him. He was watching her with the steady attention of a man who had spent decades distinguishing between things that looked the same and weren't. 12 other personnel files, she said. "You know the names." "Some of them." "Then you know this gets bigger before it gets smaller." "Yes." He adjusted his position carefully. "And you're going to be in the middle of it." "I'm already in the middle of it." She folded her hands on her knee. "I tried to be ordinary for 4 years. It didn't work." She looked at him. "So tell me what you need." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, the rain had finally stopped, and Harlow City was doing the thing that cities did after long rain. Exhaling, resettling, the streets catching light in the flat, clean way they did after everything had been washed. "There's going to be a formal review," he said. "All 63 active designations. Every record. Every altered file. It'll be run out of an independent office, outside the secondary division, outside anything So's network could have touched." "I understand." "The review will need someone who can read these files the way you read the situation here, who understands the operational context and can identify the alterations without being inside the structure that made them." He paused. "Someone who has demonstrated that their documentation survives adversarial scrutiny." She understood what he was offering. She was quiet for a moment. "I'll need Stein as legal counsel throughout." "That's reasonable." "And I want Vale's misconduct cases, the patient harm documentation, referred to the state medical board independently of the federal proceedings. Separate track. It doesn't get folded into the national security case and lost. I'll make that referral personally. And Briggs? She stopped, started again. He needs to testify about the operational decision to leave me in place. On record. Not as part of a closed proceeding. Voss was quiet. That's a harder ask. I know. She looked at the window, at the changed light. He made a choice. The choice had consequences. People deserve to know that these choices have consequences. She looked back at Voss. Even when the person who made them is someone you trust. He held her eyes for a long moment. Yes, he said. All right. She nodded. She was about to stand when his voice caught her. Miles, she paused. The soldiers you carried out of that valley, 3 of them have children now who weren't born yet. One of them has a daughter who wants to be a doctor. He stopped. Something in his face moved in a way he wasn't controlling. They've been asking about you for 4 years, every year, whether you were all right. She sat with that. It was a different kind of weight than everything else she had been carrying today. Tell them I'm all right, she said. You can tell them yourself. He held her gaze. That's not a small thing. What's waiting for you on the other side of this? She stood. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She looked at the man in the bed. This man who had carried her name for 4 years in a way she hadn't known and couldn't have prepared for. And she felt the full complexity of the morning, which was too many things at once to name cleanly. Get some sleep, she said. She walked out. In the corridor, Stein was waiting with a legal pad and a pen and the expression of a man who had approximately 14 things to discuss with her and the professional discipline not to start until she indicated she was ready. She stopped beside him. She looked down the corridor, the ordinary hospital corridor, the linoleum and the fluorescent light and the carts and the doors. This building that had tried to be done with her at 2 a.m. and had failed, spectacularly and publicly, and in ways that would take years to fully account for. She was not done with it either. All right, she said to Stein, let's start at the beginning. He opened the legal pad. And from down the hall, from behind the door of the administrative conference room where federal agents were still pulling records and the hospital board had been summoned for an emergency session that none of them had been prepared for, she heard a voice she recognized. Gerald Voss, the administrative supervisor who had sat at the termination meeting with the practiced stillness of institutional authority. And the voice was raised, which it had not been at 1:30 in the morning, and the words that carried clearly into the corridor were not the words of a man who believed the institution was still standing on the ground he thought it had been standing on. She did not stop walking, but she heard every word, and she noted with the quiet precision of someone who had been documenting things for a very long time that the sound of an institution beginning to account for itself was not triumphant. It was just necessary. And the deposition waiting for her tomorrow, and the 12 names Soe had not yet given but would, and the 63 records that needed to be read by someone who knew how to read them, all of that was necessary too. She turned the corner. She did not look back. The deposition took 4 days. Not 4 days straight. There were breaks. There were nights when they released her to the extended stay hotel 2 blocks from Mercy Crest, where Lint's team had arranged a room, and she would sit on the edge of the bed and eat whatever she had picked up from the 24-hour diner on the corner and stare at the wall while her mind continued running through the material even when she was trying to let it stop. She slept in 3- and 4-hour segments. She had slept in worse conditions. Each morning she walked back to the hospital and sat across from Lint and the second agent, whose name was Pratt, she had learned by the second day, a careful man from a field office in Denver who asked fewer questions than Lint, but whose questions were consistently the ones she had to think longest about, and she answered everything they put in front of her. Documents, timelines, the specifics of each clinical incident, the methodology of her documentation, the routing node, and what she had access to resolve the phone number and why she still had access to the directory that made it possible. That last part produced a 90-minute conversation on its own. Stein managed it. She answered what she was asked and did not fill the silences with things that hadn't been asked, which was a discipline that took effort when you were tired enough that the editing function started to slip. On the second day, Harlan So gave Lint's team 8 names from the 12 he had referenced in the loading dock. He gave them in exchange for a prosecutorial arrangement that Stein described to her afterward as consequential but not unexpected, which she understood to mean Soe would spend time in federal custody, but less than the maximum, in exchange for full cooperation that would dismantle a network that had operated invisibly for 4 years inside an office whose entire purpose was preventing exactly that. The remaining 4 names arrived on the third day. Through a separate channel, not So, but a second individual within the secondary office who had been identified through the device records and who made a different calculation than So had, faster and with less negotiation. Lint told her this during a break, standing in the corridor with coffee cups they were both holding more than drinking. "He just handed them over," Dara said. "He came in voluntarily at 6 a.m. and asked to make a statement." Lint looked at her over the rim of her cup. "Some people, when the structure collapses, they find they've been waiting to tell someone for a long time." Dara thought about that. She thought about how long people could carry things that didn't belong to them. She did not say this to Lint because it was not the kind of thing that fit into a corridor conversation, but she thought it. On the 4th day, the deposition reached its formal close with a summary statement that Stein reviewed line by line before she signed it. It was 63 pages. It covered 14 months of documented conduct, the routing node, the phone number, the timeline of the night of the breach, and her assessment of the operational structure Soe had built inside the counter-internal division. She read every page. She changed 7 words. She signed it. When she came out of the conference room into the corridor, Stein was beside her, and the late afternoon light was coming through the window at the end of the hall in the particular way it came through hospital windows. Institutional light. The kind that reminded you that buildings like this processed people in large quantities without fully accounting for the weight of each individual one. "What happens now?" she said. "Now the federal machinery does what federal machinery does." Stein put the signed copy into his case. Slowly, loudly, and in public. The medical board referral. Already filed 2 days ago. Vale's case is separate from the federal proceedings, running on its own track. He paused. His legal team is good. It will take time. I know. She looked at the window. It'll take as long as it takes. That's a very composed way to feel about it. She looked at him sideways. I'm not composed. I'm tired. She picked up her jacket from the chair where she had left it that morning. There's a difference. The formal notification of her reinstatement arrived 12 days after the deposition, delivered not as a letter but as a phone call from the hospital's acting chief medical officer, a woman named Dr. Sandra Teague, who had been brought in from outside the institution during the board's emergency restructuring, a process that had moved significantly faster than Dara had expected, driven by the specific institutional panic that comes when a hospital realizes its internal failures have become a federal matter. Teague called at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Dara was in the extended stay hotel, sitting at the small desk with her documentation files open, continuing the work she had already been doing for the past 11 days for Lint's team, cross-referencing the 12 names So had provided against the 63 active program designations to identify which other individuals might be in positions similar to the one she had occupied without knowing it. Ms. Miles, Teague said, I want to offer a direct and unqualified apology on behalf of Mercy Crest Medical Center for the conduct that led to your termination. The process was improper. The documentation supporting it was fabricated. The board has formally rescinded the termination, effective retroactively to the date it occurred. Dara listened. She had known this call was coming. Stein had told her the board had voted the day before, but knowing it was coming and receiving it were two different things. She sat with the difference for a moment. We'd like to offer you a position, Teague continued, Director of Emergency Clinical Standards. It's a newly created role. The board's acknowledgement that the structural failures identified in your documentation require not just correction but systematic reform. We're asking you to lead that reform. Can I ask who's on the board now? Reconstituted entirely. Gerald Foss resigned effective last week. The 3 board members with prior knowledge of the complaint process against you have all stepped down. And Dr. Vale's cases, the patients. The institution is in contact with the families of both patients identified in your documentation. Legal counsel is involved. That process is active. Dara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the files on the desk. She looked at the light coming through the hotel window. "I appreciate the call," she said. "I'll think about the position." A pause. "Of course. There's no deadline." Teague's voice was careful in a way that suggested she had prepared for this response and was not entirely certain how to proceed past it. "Ms. Miles, I want to say something that isn't part of the formal conversation. I've read your documentation, all of it." She paused again. "What you built and the conditions you were building it is extraordinary, and it shouldn't have been necessary." "No," Dara said. "It shouldn't have." She ended the call. She sat at the desk for a while without moving. The hotel room was quiet. Outside, Harlow City was doing the ordinary work of a Tuesday morning. Traffic, a delivery vehicle backing into a loading zone 2 floors below. Voices she couldn't quite make out through the glass. The ordinary texture of a city that had not been paying attention to the thing that had happened inside one of its hospitals and was not obligated to pay attention to it now. She thought about the position. Director of Clinical Standards. A title, an office, an institutional mandate to do in an official capacity what she had spent 14 months doing from the margins. She thought about whether she wanted it. She did not have an immediate answer. She wrote down the question on a piece of hotel notepad paper and put it to the side and went back to the files because the files were the work she currently had. And she had learned, a long time ago, that the current work was the only thing that kept everything else from becoming noise. Hot. Vale's medical board hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the deposition. Dara was notified as a material witness, which meant she would testify, which meant she would sit in a formal proceeding and present the documentation she had built to a panel that had the authority to act on it. She prepared the way she prepared everything, methodically, without performance, without the particular vanity of imagining how the moment would feel. Moments only felt significant after the fact. During them, there was just the work. The hearing was held in a conference facility attached to the state medical board's main office, a beige room with chairs arranged in a specific configuration that projected neither warmth nor hostility, just the administrative neutrality of a process that had been conducted many times before and would be conducted many times again. 6 panel members, a presiding officer, 2 attorneys for the board, and 3 for Vale's defense. A recording system. Very bad fluorescent lighting. Vale was present. She had not seen him since the loading dock morning, and the intervening 6 weeks had registered on him in ways that were visible from across the room. Not dramatic, not collapse, but the specific attrition of a person who has been under sustained scrutiny and knows it is not going well. The certainty was gone. The posture that had always communicated proprietary authority in a room was still present in its structural form. The way he held his shoulders, the stillness of his hands on the table. But the confidence behind the structure had thinned out, and what was left had the quality of a habit that no longer had the thing that made it natural. He did not look at her when she entered. She did not require him to. She was called to testify in the afternoon session. She had testified in formal proceedings before, in contexts considerably more consequential and with considerably higher ambient noise, and she approached this one the same way she had approached those, by telling the truth in sequence, with precision, and without elaborating past what the question required. She testified for 2 hours and 14 minutes. She presented the documentation by date. She explained the clinical basis for each observation she had made, the hemodynamic patterns, the pupillary assessment, the protocol that existed and was not followed, the outcomes that were documented in the hospital's own post-operative records. She explained it in terms that were medically precise without being exclusionary, because she had been trained to brief non-specialists in field conditions where clarity was not a courtesy, but a necessity. Vale's defense attorney cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He was good. He challenged the methodology of her documentation, the subjectivity inherent in nursing assessment, the possible conflation of professional antagonism with clinical observation. She answered each challenge the same way. By returning to the documented facts, the timestamps, the outcomes recorded in medical records that were not hers, and that corroborated what she had said in her own notes at the time she said it. The attorney pushed twice on the question of her background, whether her military training created an elevated standard of care that wasn't applicable to civilian practice. and she answered both times that the standard she had applied was not a military standard, but the institutional standard documented in Mercy Crest's own clinical protocols, which Vale had also been required to follow. The attorney stepped back. The presiding officer asked 2 additional questions of her directly. She answered both. She was released from the stand. She sat in the back row for the remainder of the afternoon session, because she had the right to observe and because she intended to. The federal proceedings were running in parallel. SOA's case, the dismantling of the network, the 12 names, and they would take years, because federal proceedings took years, and there was nothing she could do to accelerate that timeline that she wasn't already doing by providing materials to Lint's team. But this proceeding was different. This one operated on a scale that was human-sized. A room, a panel, a physician, a record. A consequence that would arrive in weeks rather than years. The board deliberated for 3 days. She was not in the building for the deliberation. She was in Harlow City, working, going back to the diner on the corner, sleeping in increments, running 6 miles in the morning in the rain because the rain had come back and she had never minded running in rain. She had run in considerably worse. The decision arrived in writing, delivered to Stein's office, and forwarded to her phone. She read it standing in the hotel parking lot on her way back from a morning run, still breathing from the exertion, the document rendering slowly on a phone with a cracked screen she had been meaning to replace for 2 months. The board found 14 counts of clinical misconduct substantiated by evidence. They suspended Vale's medical license for a minimum period of 4 years, subject to review. They required mandatory remedial supervision and a structured reentry program if reinstatement was ever to be considered. They referred the fabricated complaint documentation to the state attorney general for review of potential fraud and perjury charges, a referral that would take its own time to resolve but was now part of the official record. 14 counts. Suspended. Referred. She finished reading. She put the phone in her jacket pocket. She stood in the parking lot for a moment, breathing. She had thought she would feel something cleaner when it arrived. Some version of resolution that had an uncomplicated texture. What she felt instead was something more complicated. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of settling. The sensation of something that had been suspended for a long time finally making contact with the ground. Solid, real, documented. She went upstairs and called Stein. "I read it," she said. 14 out of 14, he said. "That's not a common outcome." The documentation was clear. The documentation was extraordinary, and you know it, so stop deflecting. A pause. "How are you?" She considered the question. People asked it and usually wanted a short answer, and she usually provided one. "I'm okay," she said. "I think I'm going to take the position." A brief silence. Teague's offer. "Yes. That's a significant decision. It's a necessary one." She sat on the edge of the hotel bed. The failures that Vale was able to exploit, they're not specific to him. They exist in a lot of hospitals. The culture that made it easy to dismiss a nurse's clinical assessment without consequence, to fabricate a conduct record, to move against someone through institutional process faster than any oversight mechanism could catch it. She paused. That culture doesn't dissolve when one person's license gets suspended. It requires someone to go in and do the slow, unspectacular work of changing it. And you want to do that work. She thought about it honestly. "I'm not sure I want to. I'm sure it needs doing, and I'm sure I'm equipped to do it." She paused. "Those aren't the same thing, but it's enough." Stein was quiet for a moment. "I'll call Teague." The formal recognition ceremony was Voss's idea, or at least that was what Briggs told her when he called, 3 months after the deposition, on a Thursday evening when she was in her new office at Mercy Crest, reviewing clinical protocol drafts that her team, 4 people, all of them sharp, none of them inclined to take shortcuts, had been working on for the past 6 weeks. Briggs was calling from administrative leave, which was ongoing and not yet resolved. His voice on the phone was the voice of a man who was carrying the weight of a decision that had been examined publicly and found to be both explicable and wrong, which was a harder thing to carry than being simply wrong, because explicable created the illusion of exoneration and then withdrew it. "The review board cleared me for limited duty," he said. "Conditional." "I know, Stein told me." I testified about the operational decision. He stopped. About leaving you in place. I know that too. I want you to know that He stopped again, started differently. There isn't a framing that makes it defensible. I've stopped looking for one. She looked at the protocol drafts on her desk. I know, she said. That's the right place to land. A pause. Voss wants to do a ceremony. The program review is wrapping its first phase. 31 of the 63 designations have been cleared and closed. 12 have been formally recognized as having operated under compromised conditions, which is the classification that covers your situation. He paused. There's a commendation for the field service and for the work that surfaced the network. When? 6 weeks. Washington. You don't have to. I'll be there, she said. She heard something shift on his end of the line. Dara. For what it's worth. Aaron. She used his name, which she rarely did, and it stopped him. I know, it's worth something. She paused. Go do your conditional duty. Do it well. She ended the call. She looked at the protocol drafts. She picked up a pen and went back to work. Washington in early spring had the quality of a city that was always performing significance. The monuments, the sight lines, the particular weight of institutional architecture designed to make you feel small and historical simultaneously. She had been here before, years ago, for different reasons and in a different version of herself. The ceremony was not public. She had expected a larger setting and had prepared herself for it, but what she found instead was a conference room in a building that had no signage visible from the street. 23 people, seated in rows, most of whom she did not recognize, but several of whom she did. Voss, seated and still recovering but present and insisting on it. Lint, in civilian clothes, near the back. Pratt, the careful agent from Denver, beside her. 2 individuals she recognized from the field, years ago, different contexts, people whose faces she had filed and not expected to see in a room like this, and 7 others, men and women ranging in age from late 20s to early 50s, seated in the second and third rows, who looked at her when she entered with an expression she recognized from the loading dock, the expression of people who had been found after a long time of not being looked for. She understood. These were some of the 12. The other personnel whose files had been compromised, who had spent months or years navigating situations they couldn't fully explain, carrying a kind of weight that had no public name. She sat. The ceremony was brief. A military official whose name she would remember, but whose rank she kept losing track of in the moment, spoke for 12 minutes. About the program, about the review, about what had been found, and what had been corrected and what the correction had required. He used formal language that compressed everything into the vocabulary of institutional record, which was accurate but thin. Then Voss spoke from his chair, because standing for extended periods was still not available to him, and his speaking was different. Not formal, not institutional, just a man talking about what he knew. He spoke about the field operations, about the conditions, about the specific night in the valley that everyone in the room with any connection to the program knew by its designation rather than its description. He spoke about the soldiers who had come home and what they had built in the years since. He did not make it abstract. She looked at her hands while he spoke. She was not a person who cried easily, and she did not cry now, but she was aware of the particular sensation of something long compressed finally being given room, and it was not comfortable. Necessary things rarely were. When the official commendation was presented, she stood and received it and said thank you and meant it, and returned to her seat. There was no speech from her. She had been asked if she wanted to say something, and she had said no, and the military official had not pushed, which she appreciated. Afterward, in the small reception area adjacent to the conference room, coffee, water, a table of food that the room was too serious for, but that people ate anyway because they were human and hungry. The 7 individuals from the second and third rows came to her. Not all at once. In ones and twos over the course of 40 minutes, the way people approached conversations they had been composing for a long time and were not entirely sure how to begin. She talked to each of them, a former field medic named Torres, who had been working as a paramedic in Phoenix and had spent 2 years being quietly pressured out of department after department without understanding why. A program translator named Adela, who had spent 18 months being blocked from federal contractor work by what she had thought was bureaucratic error until Soe's network was dismantled and the deliberate pattern became clear. A logistics coordinator named James, who had left the program voluntarily and then found his civilian record systematically undermined in ways that cost him 3 jobs before the review identified the source. All of them different situations, all of them the same pattern. Individuals whose value had been recognized in one context, dismissed in another, and then deliberately undermined by a network that had decided their knowledge and their history made them inconvenient rather than valuable. She listened to each of them the way she had listened to patients in the ER, not performing attention, just giving it, which was a different thing. She did not offer resolution because she didn't have it to offer. The legal processes were running. The institutional corrections were ongoing. What she had was presence, and she gave that. The medic Torres was the last. He was in his mid-30s, quiet in the way that people who had been through serious things were quiet, not withdrawn, just economical. He told her about Phoenix, about the 2 years, about the specific grinding exhaustion of trying to function in a professional environment where something was working against you and you couldn't name it. "I thought I was losing it," he said. "I thought it was me." "It wasn't," she said. "I know that now." He looked at his coffee cup. "I knew what I was doing in the field. I was good at it. And then in civilian life, nothing worked the way it should have. And you start to wonder if you were ever as capable as you thought, or if the context just made you look better than you were." She understood this precisely. She had thought it herself. In the first 2 years, before the 4th year of documentation had made it clear that the failure was not hers. "The capability doesn't disappear when the context changes," she said. "It just becomes invisible to people who don't have the frame to see it." She paused. "Which is their limitation, not yours." He looked at her. "How did you hold on to that? When everything was being taken apart?" She thought about it honestly. "I wrote things down," she said. "See, every day. Everything I observed, everything that was wrong, everything that should have been documented and wasn't. Not because I knew what it would become, just because it was what I knew how to do." She paused. "And I didn't perform certainty I didn't have. I just did the work." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." She nodded. It was enough. You see it. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Mercy Crest held its own formal acknowledgement. Teague had proposed it, and Dara had agreed because she understood that institutional accountability required public acknowledgement, that the thing done in private to someone should be corrected in public, where the same people who had witnessed the wrong could witness the correction. It was a hospital event, which meant it had the specific atmosphere of a hospital event. A room that was too warm, catering that had been arranged by a committee, and pleased no one fully. Staff who had not been told the dress code and had interpreted it in 17 different ways. She stood at the front of the room, in a room full of people she had worked alongside for 4 years, and Teague spoke about the clinical protocol reform work that Dara's team had been doing for the past 2 months, and about the formal apology that the institution was making, and about the structural changes that were required to ensure that what had happened to Dara Miles would not happen again to the next nurse who saw something wrong and said so. Dara had written remarks. She had written and discarded 4 versions of them in the 2 weeks preceding the event. The version she delivered was the shortest. She said that she did not consider what she had done heroic. She said that what she had done was the job, the work of a nurse, which was to observe and assess and speak and document, and when necessary, act. She said that the reason it had become an extraordinary situation was not because of what she had done, but because of what the institution had failed to create around her. The conditions in which a nurse's assessment could be heard and questioned and engaged with rather than dismissed. She said that she was not there to represent an exception. She was there to argue against the conditions that made her feel like one. She said that every person in the room, every nurse, every resident, every technician, every person whose name appeared below the physician line on an org chart carried knowledge that was worth something. Knowledge that had been built through hours of patient contact, through the specific intimacy of doing the actual physical work of care, through the kind of attention that required you to be fully present with someone who was frightened and in pain. That knowledge should not have to fight for space. It should not have to justify itself through extraordinary documentation or extraordinary circumstance. She said she was not done being angry about the fact that it had, in this building, for 14 months. She said she was channeling that anger into protocol. There was a response in the room that she had not anticipated. Not applause, not in the usual sense, but a quality of attention that felt different from the attention of a room listening politely to remarks they expected to find agreeable. It felt like the attention of people who had been waiting, for some time, for someone to say in an official setting the thing that they had been thinking in unofficial ones. Becca was in the room. The young nurse she had mentored, who had held eye contact on the night of the firing and looked devastated. She was in the third row, and after the remarks, when people were moving through the room with coffee cups and the specific social awkwardness of institutional events, she found Dara. "I should have done something," Becca said. Not a question, not looking for reassurance, just saying it. "You were a second-year nurse and you were scared," Dara said. "That's not a character failure, it's a structural one. The structure made it costly to speak up and cheap to stay silent." She paused. "That's what we're changing." Becca looked at her. "I've been documenting since that night, everything I see." "Good. I don't know if it'll ever matter." "It already matters." Dara looked at her steadily. "Documentation is not a bet on the future. It's a record of the present. It means the present is real, that it happened, that it can be answered for." She paused. "Keep doing it." Becca nodded. She still looked like someone carrying something heavy, and Dara did not try to take it from her because she couldn't, and also because some weight was weight that needed to be carried for a while before it became something you could work with. Marcus Vale was not in prison. She thought about this sometimes, in the way that people thought about outcomes that were correct but incomplete. His license was suspended. The Attorney General's office had opened a fraud inquiry into the fabricated complaint documentation, and that inquiry was active. He was not practicing medicine. He was, by the most recent account she had received through Stein, living in a modest apartment in a city 2 states away and doing administrative consulting work for a small medical supply company. Not exactly medical practice, not exactly not. The kind of adjacent existence that people constructed when the center of their professional life had been removed. She had been asked whether she thought the outcome was sufficient. By Stein, by Teague, by a journalist who had gotten her contact information through channels she still hadn't fully traced, and who she had declined to speak to. She gave the same answer each time. She thought the outcome was accurate. Whether it was sufficient was a different question, one she was not positioned to answer because sufficiency required a perspective she didn't have. The perspective of someone who had not been inside the 14 months. What she did not tell people was that she thought about the patient who had died. The man with the ruptured spleen, whose name was Raymond Okafor, whose death she had documented with the clinical precision of someone who had known in the moment that the documentation would need to stand without her advocacy. Raymond Okafor had 2 adult daughters. She knew this because Mercy Crest legal counsel had told her during the process of the institution's contact with the family, and she had written his name down and put it in the same locked box where she kept the other things that were real and couldn't be filed anywhere useful. She did not talk about Raymond Okafor at events. He was not hers to invoke, but she thought about him when she was reviewing clinical protocols, when she was reading the near-miss reports that her team had set up a formal collection system for, when she was sitting in a case review meeting and someone started to wave off a nursing observation with the specific dismissiveness she had spent 14 months documenting. Then she thought about him and she did not let the moment pass. Every time. The federal proceedings against Harlan So concluded 8 months after his arrest, in a courtroom in Washington that she was not present for but whose outcome Lint called her to describe. Soe received a federal sentence of 11 years on charges that included unauthorized access of classified records, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, and material support for an operation targeting protected program personnel. He had cooperated fully, and the cooperation had been reflected in the sentence, which was less than the maximum and more than symbolic. The network he had built had taken down 37 active contractors across 4 states, revoked security clearances for 11 additional individuals within the secondary office's structure, and triggered a full external audit of counter-internal operations that was still ongoing at the time of the sentencing. The program itself survived the review. 63 designations examined, 41 fully cleared and closed, 12 formally acknowledged as having operated under compromised conditions, 10 still under review, none terminated. The designation Nightingale 1 remained in the program record, reclassified from inactive to historical, which was, she understood, the program's way of acknowledging that someone had existed and had done something that warranted keeping the record. She did not know how she felt about that. She suspected she would continue not knowing for a long time and that this was not actually a problem. Lint sent her a text message the day of the sentencing. It said, 11 years, thought you'd want to know. She sent back, I did, thank you. Lint sent back a single word, good. It was, given everything, a satisfying exchange. A year and 3 months after the night of the firing, Dara Miles sat in her office at Mercy Crest, a real office, a corner one, with a window that looked out over the parking lot and the street beyond it, and on clear days, a thin strip of mountains visible above the roofline of the building opposite, and reviewed the latest cycle of near-miss reports. There were 47 of them for the month. 47 instances where a nurse or a technician or a resident had documented an observation, a concern, a discrepancy, and where that documentation had triggered a formal review rather than a dismissal. 47 instances where the thing she had built over 14 months in the dark, at her own cost, was now running as an institutional process in the light. Not all of them were significant. Many were small. Procedural gaps, communication failures, the ordinary entropy of a complex system. But 6 of them were clinical, and 2 of those 6 had resulted in interventions that the attending physicians had, in the case review, acknowledged as timely. She did not think of this as victory. She thought of it as infrastructure. She was finishing the last report when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize, area code she associated with Phoenix. Miles, she said, it's Torres, the medic from the ceremony. I wanted to let you know I got hired, Maricopa County EMS, full-time. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of something that was good news arriving uncomplicated. That's good, she said. When do you start? Monday. A pause. I wanted to tell someone who would, who would know what it means. She understood. The people in your life who had not lived through the version of you that was struggling did not fully understand the version of you that was not. They were glad for you, but they were glad for a version of the story they had always expected. I know what it means, she said. Yeah. He was quiet for a second. Thank you for what you said in Washington about the capability not disappearing. I meant it. I know. That's why it helped. She ended the call. She sat for a moment. Outside the window, the street was doing the ordinary things streets did. A delivery driver, double parking, a cyclist threading between cars, a woman in a bright coat walking fast in the particular way people walked when they were late for something that mattered to them. She thought about what she had said to Torres. The capability doesn't disappear when the context changes. It becomes invisible to people who don't have the frame to see it. She had said it as a thing she believed. She believed it more than she had a year ago, which was more than she had believed it the year before that, and the year before that. Not because it had always been true, but because she had watched it become true, incrementally, through the specific and unspectacular work of refusing to accept that the invisibility was the final answer. Invisibility was not a verdict. It was a condition. Conditions changed. She picked up the next file from her desk. There is a particular kind of woman who moves through the world quietly, not because she has nothing to say, but because she has learned, by circumstance, by training, by the specific education that comes from watching what happens when you speak too soon in the wrong room, to choose her moments, to build before she speaks, to let the record become so clear that when she finally speaks, the truth has already arrived before her and is waiting in the room when she enters. Dara Miles was that woman. She had not chosen to be precisely. She had become that woman the way most people became the thing they were, through pressure, through survival, through the particular insistence of circumstances that did not allow the easier version. She had been dismissed. She had been documented, manipulated, used, and thrown out of a building in the rain in the middle of the night carrying a cardboard box. And she had come back, not in the dramatic sense, not in the way of stories that wanted that image, the triumphant return with vindication blazing ahead of her. She had come back in the way that was harder and less photogenic and more real. She had turned around, driven 4 blocks in the rain, and done the work that needed doing. And then she had done the next work, and the next, without waiting for permission or recognition or the right conditions. The recognition had come, publicly, documented, consequential, the commendation, the reinstatement, the formal acknowledgement of every wrong that had been done and every truth that had been suppressed. All of it was real, and all of it was on the record. But the recognition was not the point. It never had been. The point was the 47 near-miss reports on her desk. The point was Torres starting Monday. The point was Becca, who sent her a documentation summary every 2 weeks with the steadiness of someone who had decided what kind of nurse she was going to be. The point was the 12 individuals whose files had been compromised and who were slowly, through processes that were not fast enough but were real, finding their way back to the work they were equipped to do. The people who had tried to make Dara Miles invisible had miscalculated one thing in particular. They had assumed that the danger was in what she might say, what she might expose, what she might claim. They had not understood that the actual danger was what she had already built, quietly, without announcement, in the margins of a job they thought they had taken from her, and what that building made possible for everyone who came after. You cannot take away what someone has built if they have built it correctly. She had built it correctly. Outside her window, the thin strip of mountains was visible above the roofline. The late afternoon light was hitting them at the angle that made them look closer than they were. And she looked at them for a moment the way she occasionally allowed herself to look at things. Not as a person who had arrived somewhere, but as a person who understood that the next thing was always waiting and that this was not a threat but simply the nature of work that mattered. She picked up her pen. She went back to work.